You know, you walk past skyscrapers every day and, well, you just treat them like mountains.
Oh, absolutely. They're just permanent geography.
Right. You navigate around them, you look up at them, but they are a fixed part of the landscape. It's just a static reality for you.
Yeah, you don't really question them.
No, you never expect a mountain to suddenly become the site of this completely surreal, impossible sequence of events. But on the morning of July 28, 1945, the tallest mountain in New York City took a direct hit.
A literal direct hit.
Yeah, from a 12-ton U.S. Army bomber flying at like 200 miles an hour.
It is the kind of image that just forces you to stop whatever you're doing. I mean, we are talking about a massive machine of war, a B-25 Mitchell bomber, completely lost in this thick soup of fog.
Just flying blind.
Exactly. And then violently intersecting with the mundane reality of a Saturday morning.
And the craziest part of the sources we are looking at today for this deep dive, and we're talking municipal archives, fire department reports, Guinness World Records data, and oral histories, is that a 12-ton bomber crashing into the Empire State Building is somehow only the opening scene.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is, because waiting inside that building is a 20-year-old woman who lives through the initial blast, right? Only to immediately face a 75-story plunge in a broken elevator.
And she survives that too.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to trace the steps of how this ordinary morning devolved into a disaster. The archival reports paint a picture that is almost eerie.
They really do. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you realize you are looking at a story about human judgment, the unpredictable nature of extreme engineering, and really the razor-thin line between a totally routine day and total catastrophe.
So set the scene for us. It's Saturday around 9:40 in the morning, summer of 1945, and the mood in the city is pretty important here, right?
Absolutely. The context of that date changes how everyone is behaving. I mean, the war in Europe is over.
Right.
The entire global mood is taking this massive collective exhale. After years of just relentless grinding conflict, New York City's starting to relax. And against that backdrop, this B-25 Mitchell bomber is in the air.
But it's not a combat mission.
No, not at all. It is a routine transport flight. It's simply ferrying the pilot toward Newark.
Which, I kept trying to picture who is flying this plane while reading the municipal reports. Because when a plane flies into a stationary 102-story building, your brain automatically assumes, well, it has to be a rookie.
Oh, for sure.
Like a trainee who panicked in the fog and lost control. Was it?
That is the most logical assumption, but the reality is much more complicated. The man at the controls was Lieutenant Colonel William Franklin Smith, Jr.
Okay.
And he was a highly decorated combat veteran. He had survived the absolute chaos of war, navigating hostile skies and anti-aircraft fire over Europe for dozens of missions.
Wow.
Yeah, he was the furthest thing from a rookie.
Which makes the crash so much harder to understand. If he is this elite, battle-tested pilot, how does he fly a bomber into the most famous landmark in the world?
It really comes down to human factors engineering, specifically something we call the normalization of deviance, or the disease of routine.
The disease of routine. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, because it is so easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to comb through disaster records and look for a villain or look for some gross, unbelievable negligence. But Smith wasn't acting out of malice.
Right.
He was suffering from a chain of small, incredibly human judgment calls. The weather that morning was atrocious.
That's awful.
New York City was blanketed in a thick, dense summer fog. We are talking about near zero visibility where the tops of the skyscrapers are entirely swallowed by the clouds.
And the control tower logs are pretty explicit about this. They actually advise him of the terrible conditions and, suggest he land at LaGuardia instead of pushing through the fog toward Newark.
They do, and he elects to push on anyway.
I kept chewing on that decision. I mean, it feels reckless on paper.
It does.
But think about it like a highly skilled commuter, right? Someone who drives the same winding, treacherous mountain road every single day.
Right, yeah.
One morning, there is a terrible ice storm, and the radio is telling everyone to pull over, wait it out, or take a different route. But that driver, because of their vast experience, thinks, I've handled worse than this.
Exactly. I know this road.
I know this machine. I know my own reflexes. Their expertise actually gives them a blind spot.
That is such a spot-on analogy.
If Smith survived the skies over Germany, a foggy Saturday morning in New Jersey probably didn't register to his brain as a lethal threat.
That is exactly the psychological trap. Expertise breeding a false sense of invulnerability. The more competent you are in extreme situations, the more you might unconsciously lower your guard in mundane ones.
Wow.
He makes that one small, fateful decision to continue. But then, the physical realities of the environment strip away all of his experience. The disorientation sets in.
And the moment where it goes from a risky flight to a terrifying one is logged right there in the radio communications.
It's chilling.
It really is. The tower gets back on the radio and gives Smith a warning that should honestly chill anyone to the bone. They specifically tell him that they cannot even see the top of the Empire State Building from their vantage point.
Just process the physics of that communication for a second. The tower is effectively telling a pilot, there is a massive man-made mountain of steel and stone directly in your general flight path, and it is completely invisible right now.
That's terrifying.
It is. And in an era before modern, highly sophisticated GPS and radar suites were standard in every cockpit, you relied heavily on visual references.
Right, you had to look out the window.
Exactly. When you lose that visual horizon, something very dangerous happens to the human body.
I was actually hoping you could explain the mechanics of that, because the archives say he comes down lower into the fog over Midtown Manhattan to try and get his bearings beneath the cloud cover.
Which is a fatal mistake.
Yeah, and he makes a wrong turn. Reportedly, he banks the wrong way after passing the Chrysler Building, and suddenly he is flying in the city, just weaving blindly among skyscrapers. How does a pilot get that turned around?
It is a physiological phenomenon called spatial disorientation, and it is absolutely terrifying. The human body is designed to orient itself on the ground, primarily using our eyes,
Okay.
but also using the vestibular system,
Yeah.
the fluid in our inner ears.
Right.
When you are flying a plane in a thick white wall of fog, your eyes are giving you zero information. There is no horizon to tell you what is up or what is down.
So your brain has to rely entirely on your inner ear.
Yes, and the inner ear is easily tricked by the physics of flight. If a pilot enters a very gradual, slow turn, the fluid in the inner ear eventually settles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it tells the brain, we are flying straight and level, even though the plane is actually banking.
That is so dangerous.
It gets worse.
Yeah.
If the pilot then corrects that bank based on an instrument reading, the sudden movement sloshes the fluid the other way.
Oh, I see where this is going.
It makes the pilot feel like they are violently tipping in the opposite direction, even though they are actually now flying straight.
So it just causes immense vertigo.
Exactly. Without a visual horizon to correct the lie your inner ear is telling you, a pilot will literally fight their own instruments. Every second that ticks by is hundreds of feet traveled at extreme speed in an unknown direction.
Which brings a terrifying inevitability to what happens at 9:40 a.m. Out of the fog, dead ahead, a wall of limestone and glass just materializes in his windshield.
Just out of nowhere.
Yeah. There is no time to pull up. There is no time to bank. At approximately 200 miles an hour, this 12-ton warplane strikes the north face of the Empire State Building, right between the 78th and 80th floors.
The amount of kinetic energy transferred in that fraction of a second is just staggering. You have 12 tons of dense metal moving at 200 miles an hour, suddenly decelerating to zero.
It's hard to even picture.
It doesn't just hit the building, it carves an 18-foot hole directly into the side of it, shattering limestone and bending the internal steel girders.
You know, up to this exact moment in the archival timeline, it reads like a mechanical tragedy. A machine lost in the weather, a human brain betrayed by its own inner ear.
Right.
But the building wasn't an empty block of stone.
Well.
And the profound, devastating irony of who was waiting right at the point of impact really stops you in your tracks.
It is the part of the municipal records that really humanizes the scale of this. As you noted, it is a Saturday.
Yeah.
Most of this towering, massive structure is completely empty. The bustling weekday crowds of secretaries, accountants, and businessmen are at home.
Thankfully.
Yes. But there is one office right around the 79th floor that is fully staffed.
The offices of the War Relief Services of the Natural Catholic Welfare Conference.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is, and tragic really, the people who found themselves directly in the path of a literal war machine were a charity group entirely dedicated to helping the displaced victims of global war.
They were doing humanitarian relief work.
They were.
You read that in the source material, and it feels like bad fiction. It is almost too cruel to be true. These are volunteers and workers, mostly young women, who specifically gave up their Saturday to come into the office to facilitate aid for people whose lives had been devastated by conflict.
It's heartbreaking.
And the war just comes crashing through their window. 9 women in that specific office died that morning.
To understand the sheer scale of the destruction inside that office space, we really have to look at the differences between kinetic energy and combustible energy.
Okay, lay that out for us.
The plane itself, the fuselage, provides the kinetic impact. But a B-25 Mitchell is carrying fuel.
A lot of fuel.
When it struck the building, 800 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel ruptured and ignited instantly.
800 gallons. The fire department reports detail flames just sweeping through the office, a wave of fire spraying down the hallways and the stairwells.
It was an inferno.
But the physical trajectory of the plane itself is what I struggle to comprehend. Because the bomber didn't just smash against the wall and fall to the street.
No, it didn't.
The records show it literally split apart, and one of the massive engines ripped completely through the skyscraper.
This goes back to the physics of mass and momentum. An airplane fuselage is essentially a hollow aluminum tube. It is relatively fragile.
Makes sense.
When it hits a dense object like a skyscraper, it crumples. It compresses like an accordion, shedding its kinetic energy as it deforms. But an engine block is entirely different.
Because it's a solid mass of steel.
Right. An aircraft engine is a highly dense, heavy, solid block of metal. It doesn't crumple. It retains almost all of its kinetic energy upon impact.
Wow.
So while the wings in the cockpit disintegrated against the limestone face, this solid steel engine block acted like a cannonball.
It just kept going.
It punched through the exterior, ripped through the interior plaster walls, tore across the hallways, smashed through the infrastructure of the Empire State Building, flew out the far side of the building,
Which is insane.
and literally landed on the roof of a completely different building across the street where it torched a penthouse art studio.
That is terrifying, just the sheer force of it. But that was only one engine.
Right.
The other engine, along with the heavy landing gear assembly, took a completely different path through the internal structure. It severed the elevator doors and plunged straight down an empty elevator shaft.
Which sets up a horrific secondary disaster. The total human cost of the morning was 14 lives. 3 men aboard the plane, including Lieutenant Colonel Smith, and 11 people inside the building.
But amidst all this unimaginable destruction, the oral histories give us these surreal accounts of survival that just defy logic.
They really do.
You had workers in the building who survived the inferno simply by sheltering behind a standard closed door in an untouched room.
Just a normal wooden door?
Yeah. The fire raged outside in the hallway, consuming all the oxygen, but their specific door held long enough for the flames to pass. Other people, trapped by the smoke, actually climbed out through the broken glass of the skyscraper to wait on the narrow ledges for the firemen to reach them.
Which is terrifying in itself. And we really need to pause and analyze the firefighting response here, because the municipal archives detail a masterpiece of emergency management that sounds physically impossible for the era.
Right. This is 1945.
Exactly. You have a massive aviation fuel fire burning nearly 80 stories up in the sky. That is a height that no fire department ladder truck could ever possibly reach, even today, let alone in the 1940s.
That was my exact question reading the reports. The logs show the fire was brought under control in just 40 minutes. How do you put out an 80th floor fire in 40 minutes when your ladders only go up a few stories? Like, where does the water even come from?
It relies entirely on the internal engineering of the skyscraper itself. Specifically the standpipe systems.
The standpipe systems.
Yeah. When engineers build a skyscraper, they know they can't rely on street-level water pressure to fight a high-rise fire. So they build a massive network of vertical water pipes, standpipes, directly into the skeleton of the building. It's essentially a vertical water main.
So the building has its own internal plumbing specifically for fire hoses.
Precisely. It is connected to massive water tanks on the roof and intermediate floors. The firefighters arriving on the scene couldn't fight this from the street.
They had to go in.
They had to grab their heavy canvas hoses, their axes, and their gear, run into the lobby, and rapidly ascend into the belly of the beast. They took the surviving elevators as high as they safely could, and then climbed the stairwells into the smoke.
That takes so much bravery.
It does. They had to tap their hoses directly into the building's own standpipe connections on the 78th and 79th floors to fight the blaze from within the corridors. It was an incredibly dangerous, claustrophobic battle, fought entirely inside the veins of the building.
Unbelievable. But while those firefighters are performing these heroic acts, suppressing the flames and pulling people from the ledges, that second engine, the one that had plummeted down the elevator shaft, had secretly set a trap.
It had.
It was a mechanical trap waiting for a young woman who had actually already survived the initial blast.
The story of Betty Lou Oliver is really the focal point of the human resilience in these archives.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's look at her timeline, because it is staggering. She is a 20-year-old elevator operator, and according to the historical accounts, it was reportedly one of her last days on the job.
Which just adds to the tragedy of it all.
Yeah. She happens to be in her elevator car near the 80th floor. At the exact moment, the B-25 impacts the building just a floor or two below her.
And the concussion of an impact like that radiating up through the elevator shaft is immense.
The blast is so powerful that she is physically thrown from her elevator car into the hallway. She suffers severe burns from the flash of the aviation fuel igniting, but she is alive.
It's a miracle she survived that alone.
Think about the statistical improbability of that. She is 20 years old, and she has just survived a direct kinetic hit from a military bomber on the 80th floor of a skyscraper.
By any logical metric, she has just lived through what should have been the most fatal, catastrophic anomaly of her life. She survived the unsurvivable. But the chaos of the structural damage around her is entirely hidden from the people trying to save her.
Right. Rescuers, who are navigating the smoke and the wreckage, manage to find her. They see she is severely injured, she is burned, and she is in shock. They know they have to make a very quick, decisive call.
They have to get her out.
They need to get her down to street level immediately, down to the ambulances in the medical staging area waiting below. So, in an act of what is purely a fatal good intention, they place her inside another elevator car on the floor.
It is the most standard, logical procedure in a rescue scenario. You utilize the fastest available infrastructure to evacuate the critically wounded. They had no way of knowing the microscopic damage to the systems they were relying on.
Because what those rescuers couldn't see through the thick black smoke and the chaos of the fire was the hidden damage inside the shaft itself.
The unseen damage.
The impact of the crash, the concussive blast, the intense localized heat of the fire, or perhaps the physical damage caused by that dense, heavy engine block that had plummeted down the shaft earlier. Something had severely weakened or completely severed the main supporting cables of this specific elevator that they just placed Betty Lou Oliver into.
The infrastructure of that specific shaft was completely compromised, but the elevator car was still sitting flush at the floor, held by the remaining friction or maybe a single stressed cable.
So it looked fine.
Exactly. It looked perfectly safe at the doors.
So she is inside. The rescuers hit the button and close the doors to send her down to the lobby and to safety. And the moment the doors close, the remaining tension on the cables gives out entirely. The steel snaps.
And Betty Lou Oliver begins to fall in total darkness.
The records state she falls roughly 75 stories. Let's really isolate that number for you. 75 stories. That is over 1,000 feet, straight down into the sub-basement pit of the Empire State Building.
To put 1,000 feet in free fall inside a metal box into perspective, that is roughly a quarter of a mile straight down.
A quarter of a mile?
You are trapped inside a steel cage, accelerating at the weight of gravity with absolutely no control over the outcome.
The accounts of the aftermath from the Otis Elevator Company, the company that designed and maintained the elevators, are terrifying to read. We have a direct quote from one of their officials who inspected the wreckage.
What did he say?
He stated that the car hit the bottom of the shaft so incredibly hard that the heavy floor of the elevator was crushed like an eggshell.
Which is exactly the physical deformation you would expect from a 75-story drop. The terminal velocity of an elevator car falling that distance, followed by the sudden instantaneous deceleration at the bottom, it generates an impact force that human biology is simply not designed to withstand.
Right.
Internal organs rupture, bones shatter. The sheer G-force of the stop is lethal.
So this is the part where the deep dive has to shift into pure physics, because when I first read these sources, I literally had to stop and reread the page.
It breaks your brain a little bit.
It does. How does a human body survive a 1,000-foot free fall in a metal box? It sounds like magic. It sounds like a myth. But the archives and the engineering reports break down the actual science of it.
It is a miraculous, perfect alignment of physical forces. It is extreme engineering and fluid dynamics converging in a fraction of a second in a way that saved her life. There are 3 primary physical factors at play here, and if any one of them had been absent, she would not have survived.
Okay, I need you to explain the mechanics of this. What is the first factor that slowed her down?
The first factor is the physical behavior of the cables themselves. When the main hoisting cables snapped at the top of the shaft, they didn't just vanish.
Right, they have to go somewhere.
We are talking about thousands of feet of heavy, dense, braided steel cable falling down the shaft alongside the elevator car. But crucial physics dictate that the cables fell faster than the elevator car itself.
Wait, if they are both falling in the same shaft under the same gravity, why do the cables fall faster?
It comes down to aerodynamic drag and surface area. The elevator car is a massive hollow box. It has a huge footprint relative to its weight, which means it encounters a tremendous amount of air resistance as it falls.
Like a parachute.
Exactly. It is essentially acting like a very inefficient parachute. The steel cables, however, are incredibly dense aerodynamic lines. They slice right through the air with minimal drag.
Oh, wow.
So these massive steel cables outpace the car, reach the bottom of the shaft first, and they start to pile up. By the time the elevator car reaches the end of its 1,000-foot drop, it isn't hitting the flat, rigid concrete pit.
It's hitting the cables.
Yes, it is hitting a massive, dense, springy mound of coiled steel cable. This created a rudimentary but highly effective mechanical cushion that absorbed a massive amount of the initial kinetic shock.
So the very thing that broke and caused her to fall actually raced her to the bottom to build a safety net. That is incredible.
It's unbelievable.
But a pile of cables isn't enough to stop a quarter-mile fall without lethal force. What is the second factor?
The second factor is the pneumatic brake, and this is where the fluid dynamics of the building's architecture really come into play. An elevator shaft in a structure like the Empire State Building is not a wide-open cavern.
Right.
It is a very tight, enclosed vertical tunnel constructed of solid walls. As the elevator car plummets downward, it occupies almost the entire width of that shaft. It is pushing all the air beneath it downward.
I picture it like a plunger in a syringe. If you put your thumb over the end of an empty syringe and push the plunger down, it gets harder and harder to push because the air is trapped.
That is the perfect analogy. It's a demonstration of Boyle's law. Because the shaft is relatively airtight, especially down near the sub-basement, the massive column of air trapped beneath the plummeting elevator car has nowhere to rapidly escape.
Okay.
As the car falls, that volume of air compresses. And as it compresses, the pressure builds exponentially, pushing back up against the bottom of the falling car. The very air in the shaft became a massive, invisible shock absorber.
That is so cool.
It actively and continuously slowed the terminal velocity of the elevator before it ever reached the bottom.
So you have this invisible cushion of highly compressed air slowing her descent all the way down, and then a physical bed of coiled steel cables waiting to catch her at the very bottom. And the reports mention a third factor, the mechanical safety systems.
Yes. Even though the main hoisting cables snapped, elevators of that era, particularly in a flagship building like this, were equipped with inherent safety systems. Otis elevators utilized emergency governor brakes.
How do those work?
These are mechanical systems completely independent of the cables, designed to automatically deploy and grip the vertical guide rails if the car exceeds a certain safe speed.
Oh, I see.
Now, clearly, they did not completely stop the car. The damage to the rails in the car was catastrophic. But the historical engineering analysis suggests that these mechanical safety jaws likely engaged enough to create massive, continuous friction against the guide rails, violently scraping and bleeding off even more speed during the long descent.
So you have all three of these completely uncoordinated physical phenomena happening at the exact same time. The cables creating a spring, the air creating a pneumatic brake, and the emergency jaws grinding against the rails.
Precisely.
Meanwhile, the rescuers up on the 80th floor realize what just happened. They have to make their way all the way down to the sub-basement. They arrive in the pit, and they start cutting into this mangled, crushed metal box, entirely expecting the worst. I mean, they are initiating a recovery mission for a body, not a rescue.
The assumption of a fatality is the only logical conclusion any emergency responder could make, looking at that wreckage. The kinetic energy required to crush an elevator floor like an eggshell is incompatible with human life.
But they cut through the twisted metal, and they find her breathing. Betty Lou Oliver is alive.
It's astounding.
Now, the medical reports are very clear. She is severely critically injured. She suffered a broken back, a fractured neck, and a shattered pelvis, but she lived.
She survived a bomber strike and a 75-story plunge in the dark in the span of about 3 minutes. It is a testament to the absolute outer limits of human biological resilience, provided the physics miraculously aligned to dampen the fatal blow just enough.
To this day, the Guinness World Records data confirms that Betty Lou Oliver still holds the world record for the longest survived elevator fall in recorded history.
A record I don't think anyone wants to beat.
No, definitely not. And what I found most poignant about her story from our sources is what happened after. She didn't just survive that single horrific day. She made a long, arduous, very painful medical recovery, but she went on to live for decades. She raised a family, she moved out of the city, and she lived a full life.
Her survival is the living, breathing human miracle at the very center of this massive structural disaster.
But while Betty Lou Oliver was being rushed to the hospital to begin this massive medical battle, the building itself, the skyscraper that was the site of all this destruction, was reacting in a way that honestly feels completely alien to our modern sensibilities. It was brushing itself off with an astonishing speed.
Which brings a fascinating historical contrast into focus.
Yeah.
We have to look at the Stoic era of the 1940s and the hidden legal legacy of this crash, which actually changed the relationship between the American public and the federal government.
Let's talk about the Monday morning normalcy, because this is the part of the municipal archives that truly broke my brain. Despite taking a literal U.S. Army bomber to the face, the structural integrity of the Empire State Building was never truly in danger.
It wasn't.
The steel skeleton of the building absorbed a 12-ton impact at 200 miles an hour, and it just held. How does a building from 1931 survive that?
It speaks to the philosophy of structural engineering in that era. The Empire State Building is not a modern glass-curtained skyscraper with a central concrete core. It was designed with a massive over-engineered grid of heavy steel columns and beams.
Okay.
You can think of it less like a rigid glass shell that shatters when struck, and more like an incredibly dense, heavy steel spiderweb.
A steel spiderweb.
Yeah. When the B-25 hit the 79th floor, it certainly destroyed the limestone facade and severely damaged the local I-beams on that specific floor. But the force of the impact was instantly distributed throughout the massive, redundant steel grid of the rest of the building. The loss of a localized section of the exterior wall was nowhere near enough to threaten the towering mass of the structure as a whole.
But it is what the management did next that I find so hard to relate to. Our sources note that a large portion of the Empire State Building was actually open for business on Monday morning.
Less than 48 hours after a plane crash.
Yes. Think about the stark contrast with our modern world. Today, if there is a water main break or a minor structural crack, they will close the street for a month to do environmental studies, safety audits, and bureaucratic reviews.
Oh, absolutely.
In 1945, a skyscraper eats a bomber on a Saturday morning. 14 people die, 800 gallons of aviation fuel burn through a charity office, an elevator crashes to the basement, and you are still expected to be at your desk with your coffee by 9 a.m. on Monday.
It is a profound reflection of mid-century psychology. The war had just ended. The entire public consciousness was deeply accustomed to massive casualties, to hearing about cities being leveled by bombs, to the necessity of relentless forward momentum despite overwhelming tragedy.
That makes sense.
The idea of shutting down the economic engine of a flagship commercial building for a prolonged period simply wasn't the default reaction. You extinguish the fire, you clean up the debris, you board up the 18-foot hole with tarps and wood, and you get back to work.
But beneath that very stoic, keep calm and carry on surface, there was a hidden legacy brewing. A massive legal battle that would actually change the rights of American citizens forever.
This raises an important question about how citizens interact with their government, because we have to remember the core legal dilemma here. The machine that caused this destruction, that killed those 9 women in the charity office, wasn't a private corporate aircraft.
Right.
It was a United States Army bomber, flown by an active-duty military pilot.
Right. The federal government crashed a plane into a civilian building. The families of the victims, the people who lost their daughters and wives in the War Relief Services office, were eventually offered financial settlements by the government.
They were.
But some of those families looked at those offers and said, no, we want our day in court. We want to sue the United States government for negligence.
And historically, doing that was incredibly difficult, if not entirely impossible, due to a centuries-old legal doctrine called sovereign immunity.
Sovereign immunity.
Yeah. It stems from the old English common law idea that the king can do no wrong. In practice, it meant you couldn't just drag the federal government into a standard civil court for damages like you could a private company or a private citizen. The government had to consent to be sued.
But these lawsuits, driven by the sheer, spectacular, undeniable nature of this freak accident, became a vital catalyst in Washington. The sources point out that a massive piece of legislation called the Federal Tort Claims Act had been stalled in Congress for a long time. Lawmakers had been debating it, but it had no momentum.
Exactly. The Federal Tort Claims Act was explicitly designed to strip away that absolute sovereign immunity. It aimed to finally allow private citizens to sue the United States in a federal court for torts, meaning civil wrongs like negligence, property damage, or wrongful death committed by persons acting on behalf of the United States.
And the public outrage and the intense legal push from the families of the Empire State Building crash helped finally push that stalled legislation over the finish line.
It was the catalyst they needed.
It was signed into law in 1946, and crucially, it included retroactive provisions specifically so that the families from the 1945 crash could utilize it to seek justice.
It is a quiet, massive legal revolution buried inside a loud public disaster. A freak aviation accident on a foggy Saturday morning ultimately gave ordinary American citizens a formal mechanism to hold the massive, incredibly powerful apparatus of the federal government financially accountable for its negligence. That is a permanent shift in the legal landscape of the country, born directly from the tragedy on the 79th floor.
It is incredible how history connects those invisible dots. From a pilot's inner ear lying to him in the fog, to a signature on a piece of historic legislation.
It really is.
But as we analyze this structural disaster, we also have to acknowledge the elephant in the room. For anyone listening to this deep dive, you cannot hear a story about a plane hitting a skyscraper in New York City without your mind instantly jumping to another day in history.
Right, it is the echo we cannot avoid.
Yeah.
For half a century, the 1945 crash was largely a forgotten footnote in New York's vast history. But then came September 2001. And suddenly, as the events of that day unfolded in real time, people began asking, hasn't a plane hit a New York skyscraper before? Did that building survive?
It is a completely natural comparison to make, but our sources are very clear that we have to draw this contrast carefully and soberly. Lazy misconceptions do a disservice to the reality of both events. We have to look at the math and the physics to understand the difference.
The comparison is visually irresistible, but the physical, structural, and intentional realities are entirely different. The 1945 event was a tragic accident born of human error and weather. A B-25 Mitchell is a relatively small twin-engine propeller plane weighing 12 tons.
Hey.
And importantly, it was nearing the end of its flight from Bedford, Massachusetts, meaning it was relatively low on fuel.
And when you compare that to 2001, the planes were massive commercial jetliners, weighing hundreds of tons, fully loaded with tens of thousands of gallons of highly combustible jet fuel for cross-country flights to California, flying at entirely different, much higher speeds, and flown with deliberate, malicious intent to destroy the structures.
Furthermore, the structural architecture of the buildings was fundamentally different. As we discussed, the Empire State Building was a heavy, dense steel grid. The towers built decades later utilized a tube-in-tube architecture, a load-bearing exterior shell, and a load-bearing central core, with largely open floor spaces in between.
So they reacted differently to the impacts.
Understanding why the Empire State Building survived so easily in 1945, because it was a glancing blow from a much lighter, slower object, with far less combustible energy hitting a heavily redundant steel web, actually illuminates the unique physics and horror of the later tragedy.
That makes a lot of sense.
Drawing this contrast doesn't equate the two events. It highlights the terrifying scale, intent, and physical energy of what happened decades later. The 1945 crash never truly tested the ultimate structural limits of the building.
So what does this all mean? We have taken this incredible journey through the morning of July 28, 1945. We have unpacked the physics, the law, and the history. But when you step back from all the technical data, you see the unbelievable duality of that day.
You have 14 human lives lost because of a thick summer fog, and a chain of routine, understandable human errors made by an otherwise experienced pilot.
You have the heartbreaking irony of 9 women killed while spending their Saturday doing humanitarian war relief work, struck down by a weapon of war after the war had ended.
And you have one young woman, Betty Lou Oliver, surviving 2 entirely impossible brushes with death in the span of 3 minutes. A direct bomber strike and a 1,000-foot plunge in the dark, saved only by a miraculous convergence of coiled steel, compressed air, and mechanical friction.
It reminds you of how razor-thin the line really is for all of us. The line between a totally routine Saturday morning and a historic catastrophe. One wrong turn in the fog, one momentary loss of spatial orientation, and the entire world turns upside down.
And yet, despite all of that chaos, by Monday morning, the heavy brass doors of the lobby were open, the debris was swept away, and people were going back to work as if the mountain had never been shaken.
Which leaves me with a final thought I want you, the listener, to ponder today. When we look at history, it so often defaults to remembering the physical structures over the human beings. History loves a monument.
It really does.
The Empire State Building took a 12-ton bomber to the jaw, it was scrubbed clean, and it opened on Monday. It got to keep its mythic status as an unbreakable piece of American architecture. The building got its story written in stone, but the true miracles of resilience that day were flesh and blood. The women in the charity office dedicating their limited time to helping others across the globe, and that 20-year-old girl falling in the dark, surviving the absolutely impossible, and quietly going on to live a full, beautiful life.
Hear the real story.
So I ask you, look at the massive permanent structures in your own city differently today. When you walk past those buildings you treat like mountains, remember what they can hide. If the tallest building in the world can completely erase the violent scars of a plane crash in just a few months, what other incredible forgotten stories of human survival, tragedy, and miraculous resilience are hiding right beneath the pristine facades of the places we walk past every single day?